Speaker, you've already had the pleasure of meeting already this morning. Please welcome former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson.
Well, Andrew, I have to say I thought we were friends until you put me on after Janet. What a remarkable presentation. How insightful that was. Janet, every morning my wife complains that instead of turning on the radio to listen to the ABC News, I go to my iPhone to see what the Australian's saying. And if you happen to be writing, yours is always the first article I go to. There's a story about two Australian diggers. During the Second World War, they'd been on duty in North Africa. They get some leave back in Plymouth. Foggy, dark night in the UK. They wander off to the pub, relieved to be alive, get themselves completely plastered. At closing time, they're kicked out onto the street. And with horror as they look at one another, one says to the other, "Hey mate, we've got a problem. We're lost. We're completely and utterly and hopelessly lost. We have no idea where the ship is." And his mate says, well, we're Australians, we know how to solve these things. This fella walking down the street, he'll be able to help us. Well, it just happened to be the Admiral of the British Fleet. Ramrod straight, gold braid everywhere, and an attitude. "Hey mate, we're lost. Can you tell us where we are? We want to get back to the ship." "I say, do you chaps know who I am?" And Jimmy looks at Billy and he says, "No, we really are in trouble. We don't know where we are and he doesn't know who he is." The cleverest thing I ever did was to choose Australian parents. I love this country. I cannot believe how fortunate I am to have lived in this country, which, when you stop and think about it, inherited the apparatus, the thinking, the philosophy, even the blood that had gone into developing freedom, and we've been prepared to fight to the end to defend it, but it was given to us on a plate. How fortunate are we to live in this country? And I say, in common with much of the West now, we are so confused, we are so uncertain, we are so easily persuaded, if you remember my earlier remarks about not knowing our past, that I don't think we even have the language to describe the conundrums that we now face and our inability to find firm ground. Believe it or not, I'm a farmer by background and I still live on a farm, and I love growing wheat crops. Wheat crops are my future, if you like, and I grow them in rich, black, heavy soils when it rains, so we're not growing any at the moment. The crops tell me how well I have tilled the soil. Are the nutrient levels right? Is there enough stored moisture in the soil to carry it through times when there mightn't be a bit of rain? All sorts of things are revealed about the health of our culture by the state of our children, if you see the analogy. Those who would insist that in the name of progressivism we have left history behind us and we're moving to a new place, some sort of, diluted, naive, modern version of the socialist idea, if you get the structures of society right, people behave rationally and perfectly and what have you, they would insist to you that we're headed in the right direction. Why then do our children, the crop of tomorrow, tell us so much about the soil we're growing them in? Record levels of anxiety, of depression and self-harm. In Australia, how can we pretend that we do not need to engage in some serious reflection? At every level, we need to recognise our culture is in serious trouble, and I agree absolutely with Janet. Culture is incredibly important. Everything flows from culture. Culture, by the way, can probably best be defined as the wrapping we put around what we really believe and who we really are. Well, who are we? What do we believe? I'd suggest to you we're lost in that Plymouth fog. As I look at the extraordinary breakdown of trust in our society, I have to say to you, we need to recognise that as trust breaks down into democracy, when people will not do what they ought to do by virtue of their own moral compass and understanding, informed, I would suggest, by the wisdom of the ages, we will seek to compel them to do what they ought to do, and freedom is lost. You want an absolutely classic example of it? We had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the banks and the financial services last year. And people will say, isn't it a good thing we had an inquiry? Because we found out that, I love that term that I think I saw Janet use the other day, the corporate cardinals. They're out there virtue signalling on every issue, but then we discover that on their core responsibility, too many of our financiers can't be trusted with our buck. Isn't that their core moral responsibility? Do the right thing? So we've had a Royal Commission of Inquiry. Well, that's a great thing. We needed to find out what was happening. And we've got 78 more recommendations. Isn't that a good thing too? Well, yes, in the circumstances, it probably is, on balance, better than not having those 78 recommendations. But here's the point. That Commission of Inquiry should never have been needed in the first place. Think of the AMP and how it came out of it. The AMP was set up in this town in 1849, I'll say it, by a reverend. We don't think they know anything now about morality, do we? And some of his friends. And in the words of its official historian, it became the most trusted institution for societal good in the country after the churches. AMP was a byword for trust. In an age when there was very little financial regulation, what went wrong? More regulations? We're already seeing the cost of it to our prosperity and to our freedom as the banks become more cautious about lending because they face more regulation, more policing, more surveillance, more public angst. It will take a long time to rebuild that trust, and it won't be done with slogans this time, will it? Alas, for those of you still involved in the political class, from a high hill of great morality, can I say, you've got a problem with trust as well. As an ex-politician, I don't suppose I should say that. But the ANU's work, which has tracked now for decades the level of trust in our political institutions at a Commonwealth level, tells us that never before have we been as distrustful of our governments and the people who serve in them. This is really serious stuff. David Brooks, in that remarkable, he's quite a writer, he really is, but in The Road to Character, talks about how we've become atomised, tribalised, and distrustful. I want to say to you that I believe we've become so tribalised it threatens our very future because we cannot properly negotiate our way forward on the enormous issues that confront us. And I don't want to make light of some of the issues that are frustrating and worrying us as Australians, and I don't want to insult anyone, but I do want to say to you, we need to sober up. We really do. We had a horrific debt crisis just 10 or 11 years ago that took the world to the brink of economic meltdown. You know, it's been resolved by vastly more debt. We should all be focused on something that is blind to where you stand on the so-called culture wars, blind to your sex, blind to whether you live in Queensland or Tasmania or whether you're young or old or the colour of your skin. We all need economic security. We want jobs, we want opportunity. We want our children to enjoy, they're pretty perceptive, according to Deloitte's, 92% of young Australians do not believe they'll have the opportunities and the economic good fortune that their parents had. That is a staggering figure. And they're right. They're right. Intergenerational theft is something we need to address. The security of our people, the job opportunities. We ought to be really focused on, well, the Quiet Australians were. They responded, I think appropriately, to Scott Morrison's message on that. And then, of course, there's the blunt reality that the unipolar global order that took place, and we assumed would last forever after the Berlin Wall came down, is now dissolving, as Tony said earlier this morning. The world looks more like a 1900s model, with some very ugly power centres emerging all over the world, and a great deal of uncertainty. And we seem to have a situation where we lack all conviction, and we're confronted by people who are totally convinced of the rightness of their cause. We better find some conviction, and we better find it fast. So in essence, what I want to say to you this morning is this. It's the afternoon now, I'm sorry. We desperately need a national conversation. And it needs to be a high-quality, respectful conversation. But how on earth are we going to start it? We don't have a framework for negotiating our way forward. We look at America, and Jonathan Haidt's just been here, I mentioned him earlier. He talked about the way in which they're unable to take their public debate forward because of that enormous fragmentation. And we're on the same trajectory. We need to get off it. Some American commentators are saying that in the battle for two versions of freedom, one of which sees politics as downstream of culture, and the other of which, in its commitment to the nanny state, telling us what we can say and therefore what we can think, sees culture as downstream of government, this great battle for freedom is probably the most intense since the Civil War. It's not a civil war, but it certainly looks like a campaign of civil hatred to me. How are we going to take forward meaningful debate and dialogue when we are, as Janet has said, so contemptuous of one another? We have to break that cycle. We really do. I mentioned the AMP. What has changed? There's an elephant in the room that we simply can't walk away from. I mentioned to you earlier that culture is essentially a wrapping around our core beliefs. We've abandoned our core beliefs. There was a time whether you went to church or not, we essentially took the view that Christianity was true. It morphed into, it's just one of many truths, into it's dangerous and you shouldn't expose your children to it. But I have to say to you, we haven't found a substitute for gluing ourselves together and finding a basis for respecting one another. We haven't found it. We haven't. We've become instead contemptuous of one another. Robert Menzies, who you will all be aware of in this country, I know there are some Americans amongst us, but Robert Menzies was our longest serving Prime Minister, 16 years in that office, a man of formidable intellect and of high training. He was a deeply educated man. And he said this: democracy is more than a machine. It is a spirit. It is based upon the Christian conception that there is in every human soul the spark of the divine, that with all their inequalities of mind and body, the soul of men stand equal in the sight of God. In other words, we all need something bigger to believe in, and that belief tradition insisted that we respect our neighbour, that we love our neighbour even when we don't like them. The golden rule that we talk about, do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Having washed that out of the system, I would put to you, we've not found an adequate substitute, and it's a very serious problem for us. As Paul Kelly, I love his writings too, Janet, in The Australian, writes, it is obvious, however, that there is a deeper problem in our society, that something more profound has gone wrong. The sense of a community of shared values is disintegrating. The most fundamental norms accepted for centuries are now falling apart as disputes erupt about family, education, gender, sexuality, marriage, tradition, patriotism, life and death. The decline in our civic virtue is undisguised. Respect for institutional authority has eroded. The idea of a common community purpose is undermined. Trust is in retreat. But the most important singular development is the transformed notion of the individual. The obsession about individual autonomy in every aspect of life: love, work, race, sex, culture and death. Put harshly but not inaccurately, it is narcissism presented as self-realisation and human rights. As I said, my son said, if you want to sound intelligent, Dad, I learnt from you that you should quote someone who is. But I think that, it really does sum up the massive way in which we've moved away from our cultural base. Well, what do we do? What call can we make? I want to put before you this idea. We need a rebuilding of civility and respect. Civility sounds like a nice, meek word, doesn't it? Hold your knife and fork properly, say please and thank you, and open the door for your mother. Am I allowed to say that anymore, or is that somehow sexist now? I told my favourite Menzies yarn in London the other day at a speech I was giving. Menzies was known, of course, for his repartee in an audience, and he was in Melbourne. And there was a lady who kept interrupting him. Hey, Bob, tell us about this. Hey, Bob, what about exporting pig iron to Japan or whatever it was? And, he was getting quite irritating. And he was known he had enormous presence and deep booming voice and for a good comeback. And eventually he paused and pulled himself up to his full height. The whole room fell silent. And he said, I say, madam, is your husband here with you this evening? She replied, no, he ain't. Why? Well, I'm just thinking he must be having a splendid time. And I was told in the UK that they all thought it was incredibly amusing, but that if I'd been a UK public figure, I'd have been excoriated for that. I mean, goodness me, let's loosen up a bit. Let's learn to laugh at ourselves again. The humorlessness of our current age is unbelievable. We are so precious. But civility, I want to put to, is not a meek virtue. It's a tough-minded virtue, even a duty that we need to rediscover very, very quickly. We need to rediscover it very, very quickly because it is the vital ingredient. The more we disagree, the more we have to give up on this business of giving and taking offence. We simply have to. I wasn't there, but I'm told Jonathan Haidt hammered that point time and time again at the Enmore Town Hall when he spoke. I don't know whether any of you were at it. You see, there's an old saying that you've all heard. I may disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death your right to say it. It's attributed to Voltaire, but it wasn't Voltaire. It was one of his many biographers, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, in America, writing in America in the 1930s. It's worth unpacking for a moment. There are several elements to it that I think are incredibly important. The first is that it's the idea that matters, not the person putting it forward. We ought to respect the person putting it forward, just as Menzies insisted we did, regardless of how we feel about them, or whether they enjoy a superior or an inferior place in society to us, if you want to argue those sorts of nonsenses. We need to respect our fellow Australians enough, even when they won't respect us, to not take offence, to respect them, let them put their idea on the table. That's point one. Point two is that actually civility is a soil in which free speech, freedom of conscience, and ideas flourish. If you don't think the other person's going to be civil, you won't put your ideas forward, will you? That's the whole idea, by the way, of a lot of the people behind the actions of a lot of the people who do not display civility. It's designed to silence us, to intimidate us. There's some people out there called the Quiet Australians who have had enough of it. Good on them. Let's get behind them. But here's the third aspect of it. When we are facing big decisions and difficult choices and deep differences over how we're going to come and find common ground, you won't get ownership of the negotiated outcome. You won't be able to negotiate the outcome, and you won't get ownership of the negotiated outcome unless people feel they've been heard, they've been able to put their questions, and they've been able to walk away thinking, well, I didn't get everything I wanted, but I was heard and I do understand. Fundamentally, decent people want to negotiate their way forward. They know they won't always get everything they want. One of the great things about John Howard was people knew what they were getting. He was frank and he was transparent and he was civil. It was one of the secrets to his success. I used to watch him sometimes interacting with people, and I knew him well enough, I'd worked with him closely enough to know how strongly he disagreed with the views put forward to him. But he never showed it. He'd engage and he'd talk it through properly. We must rediscover that art. We've simply got to completely reject the modern version of the adage, which is that if you dare disagree with me, I will fight to the death your right to put it. And I will call you a racist, or I'll call you a bigot, or I'll call you a hater, or accuse you of hate speech. Or, as I said earlier, the ultimate insult, I'll claim that you and those who believe what you believe have a lower cognizant ability. You're dumb. You're stupid. And we've heard it. We've heard that said. It was said during the gay marriage debate. It was very unhelpful and very unreasonable. I learnt a long time ago in politics that some of the wisest people are to be found in the back blocks of this country. Let me put a plug in for the bush. From people who may not have even gone beyond year 10. And they understand life and they understand the world and they listen to the ABC and they filter the bias, they work out where things really lie, and you don't take them on because they know what they're talking about. But they don't have those formal qualifications. We have to resist that attempt to shut down debate, if necessary, by being very strong and resolute, through gritted teeth, insisting on debating the issues. The second thing I want to say about civility is that this massive problem of the breakdown of trust in our culture can only be restored by a number of virtues, but civility is key to them as well. You will not trust people who are not civil and not respectful. And why should you? Why should you? The massive task of restoring trust in our institutions, which is critical to us going forward, requires a reinvigoration, in my view, of civility. Now, the third thing that I want to finish on in relation to civility is this. In a demos, a democracy like ours, we need, as the people, as the voters, to re-establish virtue and civility. If we're looking for character in our leaders, as one who profoundly believes that in a democracy like ours, politics is downstream of culture, not upstream, we really have to be committed to being citizens who recognise and reward character. Menzies himself spoke on this. He said, "The supreme test of the efficacy of democratic self-government is the national character. However perfect may be our mechanics of government, that government will have proved disastrous unless it encourages amongst its citizens the cardinal virtues of unselfishness, a broad and human charity as the Apostle Paul understood it, manly independence, and the passionate love for true justice to all men and women." Amen. There's a job to be done. The Quiet Australians have given us the opportunity, I think, to regroup, to re-find our foundations. Can I urge us all then to grasp that opportunity with all enthusiasm and with all courage and re-establish those great virtues of respect and of civility in a direct repudiation of what we can call, after Janet's magnificent address this morning, the politics of contempt. Thanks very much.
It's just fantastic, isn't it, to hear John Anderson and his musings. If you want to hear more, he's too polite to suggest it, but he does a fantastic series of podcasts and interviews. You go to johnanderson.net.au, and it's just magnificent.